Hello, everyone. Welcome. History 102. We're going over test number 2. All right. Let me make sure I get your names in there. So please be sure that you do your best in the submission of your answers, because while the first one I allow unlimited submissions, I don't on my second and third. But before don't stress out on that, because just remember that this is one of like 16 50-point assignments in the class. All right, just one of 16. So just do your best. All right, let's see here. Make sure I get all names. As I'm writing these names down, are there any comments or questions?
The quiz or the test, is based off the readings, not text, not from the textbook, but of the write-ups or the paragraphs.
Yes. Um, it is, to be honest, it's primarily from your argumentative assignments. The ones that come straight out of the textbook, I preface the question, so you should be able to know precisely uh, which ones are out of the textbook. But yeah, with this one, it is almost solely from your argumentative assignments. Okay, I'd like to think that I don't mean that arrogantly. I'd like to think that I amalgamate in those argumentative assignments the textbook as well as several other sources. So it's kind of everything mixed together into those assignments. So that's why I feel comfortable to do that. And then I also, however, have the separate quizzes, and those alone are solely from the textbook. Okay. All right. So what I want to do is jump through the material. All right. So with it starts chronologically with the progressive movement. All right. So with the progressives, what do you need to remember? Is just remember that by and large, it's difficult putting a broad definition to the progressive movement, trying to broadly label a certain key demographic and identity to them, and even purpose, because it was so variegated. There were so many different arms and branches to the progressive movement. But generically, I go ahead and try to give it a go. So progressives, right, according to Richard Hofstadter, were primarily old middle class reformers, the old middle class prior to the Industrial Revolution. So basically highly connected to the intelligentsia, because you haven't developed yet a technical white collar class, right, in the factories of supervisors and engineers, etc. So largely it's like lawyers, the big university professors, journalists and writers, right? Um, Petty, small family owned, moderate sized businessmen, business owners, etc. Right? So it was primarily old middle class. It tended to be primarily WASP, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Um, and they generically they perceived problems, excesses, injustices in their time period during the second industrial revolution, and they wanted to mitigate, to make those problems less bad, or even eradicate those problems. All right. Also, what were some of the main fields in which they fought? Well, the most salient seems to be against big business, right? They wanted antitrust legislation. They didn't like the idea that the capitalist system at that time period was very um, scarcely regulated, and they wanted more government regulation. They thought it was too Darwinian, and they felt like kind of in Marxist fashion that it was kind of parasitically unfair, that the big businesses had way too many advantages over their smaller competitors, and they also lorded power over their laborers, right, in their own corporations. And so they resented that, and they wanted to do something about that imbalance, right? So largely what they wanted to do to combat that imbalance is they wanted bigger government, to more highly regulate them, right? And they also wanted to give more opportunities to a combination of bureaucrats who are well trained in economics and political science, sociology, etc., right? To be able to use their brains and try to utilize, almost their sense of like the natural laws of the economy and the natural laws of things, right? Kind of a little bit of enlightenment underneath all this, and also give more power to the common people to hold big business in particular accountable. All right. So they were more, it's kind of the origin of today. They were more in line with equity, right? And parity. They wanted more people to have more opportunities economically in particular, right? And feel like they have a true shot, a true stake in society. They also were concerned what they believed to be the breakdown of the Victorian era. The Victorian era was really big on Judeo-Christian values, with sexuality in particular, drinking and other vices, right? And they saw a breakdown of that during the Second Industrial Revolution, and in particular, they saw the breakdown of the nuclear family of mom, dad, and the kids, and they wanted to do something to rectify that problem, right? So they went after alcohol, they went after prostitution. Some of them even tried to eradicate or make very difficult the process of divorce. Um, they wanted to, do those sorts of things, right? For On behalf of the family. They also another facet that I may not have mentioned in the handout is they were preservationist and conservationist as well, right? So preservation, they wanted, or let me start with conservation. They wanted a more responsible stewardship of the resources in the country. They felt like there was way too much waste. And it wasn't just an environmental perspective that they were taking, that they didn't like that inherently, right? The type of wastefulness that big businesses and others were engaging in with our resources. But they also felt like the waste, right, could be streamlined. That if you could mitigate that waste, you could make the productive process quicker and cheaper. And in doing that, right, theoretically, you could cut your overhead and not have to pay out as much as a business owner. And with that extra money that you're saving, with those extra products that you're producing, you might be able to lower the price of your goods for all American consumers. And you also might be able to pay your better wages to your laborers. Speaking of that, with the laborers, many of them were pro-union, the progressives, that is, right? They wanted to enhance anything to enhance the opportunity of the common person to realize the American dream, right? And so the workers, they by and large supported unionization to engage in collective bargaining for better wages, safer working conditions, fewer working hours, right? They also wanted to help out the modern consumer. So they wanted protective legislation that we're familiar with now to guarantee, or better ensure at least, that the products that are being made by big business are not dangerous and harmful to the consumers that are buying them, right? And so you have those components. And remember, going back to so I mentioned conservation, preservation, right? It was the idea, I think, of Teddy Roosevelt and his buddy Pinchot. He and Pinchot were well-to-do men. They had the leisure and the extra money to engage in lots of traveling, right, and other things. And he was highly of the mind, Theodore Roosevelt, that is, that communing with nature revitalizes the human spirit, right? Almost a Thoreau type stuff. That there was something so artificial and mechanical about industrialized urban life that it put people in a sense of malaise, almost a emotional illness, and feeling displaced in this new modern anonymous world, right? Mass world, and the individuals getting swallowed up. So they knew that as happens in other facets of life, that the rich would buy up the most gorgeous landscape areas in the country, and they would fence it off so that other people would not be able to enjoy them. And they wanted to prevent that. They wanted the government to buy certain preserves, right? So we're familiar with now Yosemite and all kinds of places, right? Yellowstone. so that the common person at an affordable price on behalf of the government could come and enjoy those places, the beauty, the serenity, the escape, the catharsis, and all that. All right. So they stood for all those things. And so according to court history of the progressive movement, they were altruistic. They put the needs of society. They were civic minded. They put the needs of society ahead of their own selfish middle class interests, and they were trying to altruistically help out the less fortunate in particular, right? The hardworking working class person and the marginalized, those who were kind of kicked to the corner and didn't have the same opportunities as everyone else. I would say, however, as an aside, they were pretty weak in their record on race relations with African Americans in particular. Some tried to go for anti-lynching laws. Some very few openly, publicly took on the Jim Crow laws in the South, but kind of a weak record, to be honest, during the progressive era to ameliorate that problem that African Americans were facing. But nevertheless, let's see here. Also, in light of court history, as I subjectively would say, if someone were to ask me, okay, I want you to write an argumentative piece and I want you to adhere to court history on the progressive movement and make them out, portray them as altruistic do-gooders. Well, when I think about that, I would think, okay, well, I could take the court history route of Teddy Roosevelt as far as great man history, and I could go into people like Lillian Wald and Jane Addams and Jacob Riis, right? So remember with Lillian Wald and Jane Addams is they established the settlement house movement. They would go into a marginalized area. Oftentimes it was an ethnic enclave of new immigrants, right? Like there were areas in Chicago and in New York and the Five Points, etc., that consisted of very poor Italian immigrants and Americans and Austrian and Hungarians in Chicago, etc., and Poles. And they would come in and they would provide free of service education, English classes to get your GED, somewhat equivalent thereof. They would help take care of children. They would provide recreational sports to get the poor kids off the street, and a myriad of other services they would provide, right, free of charge to the poor immigrant group that's living in that neighborhood of that city. Jacob Riis, right? He became what was known as a muckraker, right? The muckrakers were trying to bring about popular indignation. And I remember, like with your religious studies, indignation is righteous anger. It's something that you ought to be angry about, right? And so they would show brutal conditions in the factories, evidence of child labor exploitation, right? Products that were very dangerous, right? Canned meat that people were getting food poisoning from consuming, et cetera, et cetera. And they were exposing it onto the newspapers, the magazines, et cetera, and their books. And so, at any rate, Jacob Riis became one of those, where you have a story which he had a problem with alcoholism as a Danish immigrant himself. He was well educated, but he kind of fell through the cracks here in America. And he was helped out by settlement house workers who discovered his talent for writing and his educational background. And so he got a job with a local newspaper. And when he came into the infamous Five Points, he noticed the dilapidated state of the buildings, how unsanitary and dangerous the living conditions were and pitiful, a sense of just despair amongst the inhabitants of that neighborhood. They had no hope for the future. And in that sense, right, there was the idea that there was something called it like a cycle of poverty, right? So sociology was coming out with a bang from the University of Chicago, et cetera. And so notions, right, that there are systematic conditions and environments that keep people down, where they're likely going to turn in their despair to criminal activity, to alcoholism and drug abuse, et cetera, et cetera. So they would come in and try to combat that, right? Well, Jacob Riis, he took many pictures and he wrote a book with those pictures calling it How the Other Half Lives. And he wanted America to see how awful the conditions were for the poor immigrants in the Five Points of New York City on Manhattan. And so like I said, I subjectively might look into one of those figures if I were to try to portray them in the court history fashion. All right. Uh, Teddy Roosevelt, Richard Hofstadter has an interesting take on him, a psychological take. is he notes that in his writings, Teddy Roosevelt was very close to an elder sister, and he confided in her and wrote very often to her, and he kept a diary. We have an extensive, network of writings by Teddy Roosevelt himself to look at now. So at any rate, in those writings, he conveyed, right, that he sensed that he kind of embraced the old Roman, like Cicero and Tacitus at the time of the Roman Republic, the idea of noblesse oblige, the nobleman's obligation, that if you are well off, right, it is your God-given and societal duty to pay it forward, to help those who can't defend themselves. And it's not only seen as romantically and benevolent, but it's also even seen, according to Teddy Roosevelt's rhetoric, as manly, that's like what a knight in shining armor does, is he fights for the less fortunate. And so you see in his writings, even from the time he was in college as a student, as a young man, him conveying disdain for the other rich kids like himself who were in Harvard and were just wasting their parents' fortunes and living a superficial and selfish lifestyle. But no, he didn't just say that it was unethical and selfish, as he stated also that it was unmanly. And that was a big part because remember, this is a time of social Darwinism with the whole imperialism in the Spanish American War, right? And so he connected to manliness as well. And so when he came in, right, he fought for protection of consumer rights with what they bought and consumed. So the Food and Drug Administration with the Meat Inspection Act and the Federal Inspection Act. He would go to Congress and he would tell them, here's what needs to be done. You need to do this, this, and this, right? And remember, because in the Constitution, it says that the president ought to give a State of the Union address and suggest legislation to Congress with the whole checks and balances system. He took it a little step further, arguably, and he pretty much demanded certain changes from Congress. And he told them, if you don't do this, I'm going to go over your head to the public, and they're going to become ashamed of you, and they're not going to reelect you next term, at least as House reps at that time. And so, at any rate, he fought for protective legislation, right? He fought for regulation, in particular, of the trusts. He implemented the Sherman Antitrust Act, which seemed to be almost untouched by the Gilded Age presidents before him. And his Department of Justice went after a handful of trusts and brought them to the courts and had them tried for violation of that Sherman Act. All right. He also, in particular, knew how hated the railroads were. And so he went after a railroad trust, and he also really implemented the Interstate Commerce Act, right, where it said that rates ought to be uniform and fair for everyone that you're charging as far as railroad freight, and that those prices ought to be reasonable and just. Well, he established an Interstate Commerce Commission that actually carried that act out and held the railroads responsible via the Hepburn Act, etc. He made railroads regularly send in their paperwork to him to see what they were up to with their spending, etc., to make sure they weren't engaged in graft and bribery and other types of things that had happened, right, during the Gilded Age. Like, for instance, that under Ulysses Grant's administration with the railroads. So at any rate, he did those such things, right? Let's see here. He also, however, would never, almost always openly conveyed a disdain for anyone too far to the left, however, right? Remember, left, you want radical change from the norm and from tradition in the past. And so socialists, anarchists, right? Anything that smacked of Marxism, he was frightened by, he was disdainful toward, right? And so, and he conveyed that with his words as well as in his actions. And so he conveyed an image, like by way of the Pennsylvania coal strike, of being like an impartial father figure over the economy, and that he was not going to choose sides, particularly between the employers and the employees, for instance, during strikes, but that he was going to take it case by case and try to adjudicate as a good father-like figure and referee whoever was in the right in that given instance. And so we took a middle ground with the Pennsylvania coal strike. The Pennsylvania strikers did not get everything that they asked for in their demands, but he made the employers, he even threatened them to take over their company, made them come to terms through collective bargaining with their strikers, and he was proud of that role. So mind you, he wasn't too far to the left. He wasn't that radical of a progressive. Radicals, right? Like I think of like Fighting Bob La Follette, Hiram Johnson, these other figures. Um, they uh, they wanted, for instance, government control. They wanted basically gas and water socialism. They felt like certain things like water and electricity, right, utilities, perhaps education, perhaps medical care, that those ought to be separated from the capitalist system, not as as everything else. You either earn it, right? You earn the money to buy that product and have that service, or you don't, right? The old American tradition of meritocracy. But instead, right, they said certain things ought to be considered rights, right, instead of privileges, that everyone ought to be entitled to, regardless if they could pay for it and afford it or not. And hence, right, education, water, electricity, public transportation, etc. So, for instance, the gas and water socialists were more radical, more to the left on the progressive wing. And our two presidents that claim to be progressive, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, neither of them even came close to going that far in that direction. All right. And so, at any rate, then looking at uh, the revisionist interpretations, right, to the progressives. Revisionists contend that the progressives had an agenda of their own. They too, like many other factions of society of that time period, had self-interest in mind. So for one, right, Richard Hofstadter is famous for his anxiety thesis, for lack of a better way of putting it. He stated, right, that he that the old middle class was becoming eclipsed in public prestige and in economic wealth and political capital, their connections to government, right? They were losing their status to big business, to these parvenu, these nouveau riche Carnegies and Rockefellers. So that hence there was an element of sour grapes, that they were just simply envious, right? And jealous of losing their power to them. And so hence that's why largely they were so anti-big business. And after all, right, when they tried to reform people's morals and values by way of the settlement house program, stuff like that, right? They entitled this new type of morality middle class values, right? And so how convenient, right? They were making themselves the heroes. They were getting their own names in the newspapers as the heroes of the poor and less fortunate. So Hofstadter kind of introduces that thesis on a popular level in the 1950s and 60s. Um, and then also, right, McGarr in his book, M little c, big G, ERR. In McGarr's book, right, he contends primarily that the progressives were afraid of getting caught in a revolution or class war. When you look at, again, you can almost overemphasize the angst that generation felt, as proof in the writings of that time period and the reactions at that time period over things like the Haymarket Square riot, the Pullman strike, the Homestead strike, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the populist movement and the Granger movement. There was a lot of angry sentiment on behalf of small cash crop farmers, industrial laborers. It's no coincidence, say some at this time, was the heightened popularity of those on the far left. The Socialist Party under Eugene Debs became very popular and got a lot of numbers underneath it, right? And some of them, like I said, were syndicalists and anarchists who were for literally doing away with the capitalist system. So almost rhetoric, and some of them, like the Wobblies, were actually okay, at least in their written platform, with violently doing so, right? And so hence you have evidence that perhaps the middle class reformers also wanted to publicly punish big business, right? To give a sort of catharsis to those underneath them. I think of, and if you'll indulge me, perhaps a poor analogy, like an elder brother or sister who's abusive toward a younger brother or sister when mom and dad are away. And then before the younger brother or sister really comes to perhaps a very extreme resort of just snapping toward the elder sibling, The parents find out about it, come back, and they punish that elder sibling in the presence of the younger sibling to make that sibling feel better, right? Release those negative emotions, hence catharsis. And so we have quotes from Teddy Roosevelt telling that basically to JP Morgan: relax, I'm not going to go after all your trust and activities. The public needed to see you punished, right? That's a loose paraphrase, but you have quotes of that nature. Um, and so also giving hope to the less fortunate, right? Perhaps not so much of actually helping them attain socioeconomic ascension into the middle class, but at least giving them hope that they can attain that, right? So they'll be less inclined to join a radical union or organization or support the violent overthrow of the system or do something more dangerous. So hence feeding them hope as well, right? Some might say revisionist. And and you have quotes from even someone as saintly as Jane Addams contending that in McGair's book, saying basically, another loose paraphrase, every young man, every young immigrant poor boy that she helped turn in the right direction was one fewer person that she had to worry about robbing or raping or harming her nieces in the future. And so you have that component to revisionist historiography as well. All right. So let's see here where we are. Um, I feel like we've done numbers 1 through 4, 6, 7. Um, number 8. Let's see here. Right. Number 22. Number 23. All right. Uh, Another component, right? Like going back to the idea of trying to, the reformers trying to become the superstars, according to revisionist historians, right? And trying to remake society in their own mold, according to their own middle class culture, right? Or somewhat Victorian culture. Um, you have the complaint, right? That in the settlement house movement, you have the complaint in modern historiography that they were trying to make mini-me's of the poor and the immigrants. They were trying to get them to assimilate and become more WASP middle class in their values, etc. Right? And one of the key examples that they repeatedly use is individualism. Right? That's been highly tied to American rhetoric and our political tradition. But when you look at the Italians, the Southern and Eastern Europeans that were coming in such large numbers in the 1890s, like a young woman named Rahel Galub from Russia, she came and everything was collective in her culture, right? You don't think of yourself. That's selfish. You put the family first. So you go and work and you give all of your wages to the family and you don't keep any of that money. You don't attain or you don't seek attainment of your own dreams of going to college, etc. Right? But you work for the family and you put the family, the nuclear family, even the extended family and community above your own aspirations, right, and ambitions. And of course, they were not encouraged that at the settlement house movements. They were encouraged to put themselves first, put their career first, put their education first. And in cases like Rahel Galub, who had written about this, we see that cultural conflict, right, where she felt torn, where she was so impressed with the progressives and so enticed to improve her state, but she felt like she was being a traitor to her own father. Okay. And so you have that component as well. So I'm dealing with here like numbers 24. Um, let's see here. Um, there's another one. Sorry. Get it here soon. Well, at least 24 for right now. I believe it pertains to another one as well. But I'm just crossing these out to make sure that I'm technically going throughout the whole test without what you need to know. Okay. Um, Also, however, remember for the test that the progressives were environmentalists, not just environmental conservation and preservation, but when it comes to like sociology and psychology, they believe that the whole thing of nature versus nurture, they highly emphasize nurture, right? That your environment, your upbringing, your circumstances largely mold you into who you become more than your DNA. So hence, right, they wanted to remove people, these poor immigrants and others, into these healthier environments, they believed, whereby they could become more ambitious in a good way for their own future and engage in self-cultivation, improving themselves, educating themselves, accumulating skills that are applicable to the workforce and to their own success, etc. But on behalf of criminal activity of the youth, especially amongst the poor immigrants, they were very prone to adhere to sociology, is they did not want to punish as far as the prison system goes, right? They wanted to reform. And we've had that, that dialogue and debate, at least going back to the antebellum reform movements just before the Civil War. And so that debate came back freshly in the around 1900. And so they established juvenile facilities that were separate from jails and prisons for adolescents, right? And try to reform them rather than punish them. They wanted to be kind of light in their punishment of kids. They tried to do everything they could to get kids out off the farms as tenant farmers, as well as out of the factories. And they had limited success. There was nothing as far as a national law by Congress that made public school attendance mandatory or anything like that. But they sure tried. Okay, and so and remember also that with the progressive movement, let's see here. So we've also done number 27. Um, let's see here, number 25. All right. Um, they also, the progressives, right, were the conservative argument in your argumentative handout is, remember, the gas and water socialists and those further to the left. Progressives were for they were for graduated income taxes, for instance. They had no problem with taxing not only more, right, because of course 7% of 100,000 is a lot more than 7% of 10,000. Not only more in tax revenue from the rich, but they actually even wanted to tax a higher tax rate, even a higher percentage from the rich. And so that they could, there was a somewhat of a punitive element to it, an assumption that included kind of a paradigm shift, right? That under old American rugged individualism, if you become wealthy, the assumption was you earned it, right? You had done the right things, right? The conservative argument, like we had in the handout of the Gilded Age with Rockefeller and Carnegie, that you worked hard, you were intelligent, you made shrewd decisions and sacrifices, and you shouldn't be punished for your success. The progressives didn't take that view. They said they almost implied that, you know what, if you're doing that well, you can not only afford to share with the less fortunate, it'll not only be in your best interest to share with the less fortunate, because there might be a revolution again from below, right? But also you likely engaged in some type of parasitical exploitation of your laborers and ruthless dealings with merging and buying out smaller competitors. So there was almost a punitive element to it as well, right? And so to this day, the conservative argument is that progressivism, at least in its far left wing, it goes against the American tradition of meritocracy, that you get what you merit, that you get what you work for. Because after all, right, with gas and water socialism, you're entitled to certain things, whether you could afford it or not, whether you're working or not, etc. And so that's a conservative argument, right, that you see in the handout. And remember, there's a liberal rebuttal to that in the handout as well, but I don't see it here on the test. And then as far as Teddy Roosevelt, or I'm sorry, let's see here. Uh, so note, right, as well, is they call it a countervailing balance theory. Is they believed, progressives by and large, that there needs to be equilibrium, balance, right, in the old scales in society of different factions. They felt as if big business were way too heavy, way too strong, and it was creating a great imbalance. So they wanted to both increase democratic forms of government, like the initiative and the referendum. The referendum, right, where votes, where legislation is at the state level is handed over to the inhabitants themselves, and they democratically decide on that issue, that topic. The initiative, right, is when the citizens take the initiative and they get 100,000 signatures. They give it to their state legislator, and the state legislator has to address that issue, right? The recall, right? Um, the direct election of senators rather than them being chosen by state legislators as originally in the Constitution. So they were for democratic advances, right? But again, but they also, right, especially at the city government level, they wanted experts to be in charge. They wanted a city engineer, right, in charge of everything to do with infrastructure that entailed engineering know-how. They wanted people with degrees in economics and these other appropriate fields to be at the helm of local government. Many of them did, like Bob La Follette. So at any rate, right, some people see that as a contradiction. I don't. It's there's nothing intelligent about my interpretation here at all. It's pretty shallow, but I just think they both, right, that both more democratic involvement over the governmental process and bureaucratic rule by experts would both help counterbalance the influence of big business. All right. So that's my simplistic view on that. I don't see that as a contradiction in terms, because in some ways they were very democratic, in other ways they were kind of elitist about educated people ruling. All right. And then lastly, with that, Woodrow Wilson, as a progressive, he had very strong rhetoric against trust, but his administration did not break up as many trusts as Taft's administration prior to his, which didn't even pretend to be progressive as an administration. However, what he did initiate is he initiated the Federal Reserve System. And remember, the idea is that people hated the idea of parasitical, selfish private bankers running the economy. So now you have the government involved with 12 regional banks, right? And enabled to be subsidized by this Federal Reserve System, right? And bailed out at times. In return, you have to show your paperwork to the Federal Reserve, and they look over and they can give mandates, requirements on your lending practices, for instance, right? They want so many loans, beginning businessman loans, right, for 50,000 or more in a given year to be given out, etc. So it was the idea of it. The intentions were supposedly progressive behind the Federal Reserve System, and his Clayton Antitrust Act kind of put teeth into the Sherman Antitrust Act. It gave examples of violations of the antitrust law. It gave specifics: price gouging, price fixing, etc. So now it's much more easily enforced, right? Because now you can look at a list of examples and say, okay, right there, you're clearly doing that activity right there. And so hence you're in violation of the antitrust law. All right. So that was Woodrow Wilson claiming, our second president to claim to be a progressive. All right. Before I go on to imperialism, are there any questions? All right. So with imperialism, right, as you see here, um, remember court history of the Spanish-American War, right? When we fought Spain in the Philippines and in Puerto Rico, um, and of course in Cuba, to help these colonial societies gain their independence from Mother Spain. All right, in 1898, in the spring of 1898. So at any rate, the thesis is in court history. We can't deny that we did it, right? So the next best thing, as far as writing patriotic history, is you contend that we were pushed into it, right? That we were the quiet guy in the bar that didn't want any trouble, and the fight came to him rather than him looking for one. And so you have evidence of yellow journalism, right? Sensationalism in the press, likening the Cuba Libre, the Free Cuba cause, liken it to our war for independence prior to this. The Spanish as guilty of human rights violations, right? Especially Valeriano Weyler and his concentration camps that he established in Cuba. Um, you also have these ideas that were percolating. Remember, that's number one on your imperialism handout. The role of these ideas that I generically called dangerous, right? Social Darwinism, right? And people like Nietzsche and others really taking it to an extreme, right? That life is about battle for survival. That's just the way things are. You can't make ethical stance on that. It is what it is. And that if anything, you ought to go with it. You ought to even facilitate or expedite the process of survival of the fittest by conquering smaller nations and getting what you can for your own survival, right? Um, you have also Malthus, his whole dilemma about there being waning natural resources in the world and a burgeoning population, and that eventually there would be too many people with not enough resources, and that there would be this apocalyptic war between peoples, according to Gobineau and Chamberlain, between races over scarce resources like water and oil, etc. Right? Um, you have those who stress the need for geopolitics, right? Like Alfred Thayer Mahan and others who contended, right, that you need to deal with the what ifs, and you need to be ahead of the game. So you look at a map, for instance, like a chessboard, and say, okay, who is likely in the future or now to be our greatest threat on the globe? And then so what resources will be vital for us to be prepared to fight them, right? What areas of the world do we need to control, at least commercially, if not militarily, right? In order to be prepared to fight them. Um, and then when you're going over those geopolitical areas, so for instance, the Caribbean, right? The Pacific Ocean, our backyard, when you look at those areas, you don't take no for an answer. You start off with quid pro quo diplomacy and say, hey, Samoan Islands, if you grant only us the right to have our naval ships and our merchant ships come and put and refuel with coal for our steam engines, we'll grant you special privileges with our American goods, etc. Right? But if they say no, you don't take no for an answer. You even are willing to bully them to maintain um, preparedness in these geopolitically, strategically important places on the globe, just in case you go to war, right? And so people like James G. Blaine and others, right, in the government, Henry Cabot Lodge, they read these works and they believed them. There's evidence that they sincerely adhered to these beliefs, and hence they pushed our government to have a much more aggressive foreign policy, to bully ourselves into the Asian markets in Korea and China, right? To get ourselves these special treaties with the Samoan Islands and the Hawaiian Islands and the Caribbean islands, etc. Right? And so, to me, James G. Blaine represents that adherence to these beliefs, a more aggressive foreign policy, um, um, uh, more military preparedness. They established in 1883 a Naval Appropriations Act that spent $1 billion on a new navy. The first one was the USS Iowa that became famous, and they were named after states. And so, but uh, but with the objective, right, that these ships would not no longer just guard our coasts, as some of the European powers had once called our navy a mosquito fleet, right, a pathetic little mosquito fleet just defending the coasts. But now they could go out into the Pacific Ocean, right, into the Caribbean, and fight an aggressive war successfully. And so you have all of that. And then you also have in revisionist historiography, historians like Walter Lefebvre. And they suggest, I hope I'm not going too far in my interpretations of Walter Lefebvre's books, but they really get the dirt on us, you guys. And they suggest a bit of a plutocracy, right? A rule by the rich, whereby, like Horace Mann with the Unsan mines of Korea, where they had connections to these corporations that stood to profit, right, from gaining access to certain markets in certain areas, right, and commodities and land purchases, etc., and that they use their diplomatic and political connections to make that happen, to bully concessions, economic concessions from these areas of the globe, right? So you see that with James G. Blaine, you see that with Horace Mann and others, and you find that in books of historians like Walter Lefebvre's. Okay. So any questions? All right. Let's see here. So going back to historiography of the Spanish American War in particular, right? So court history says that yellow journalism was manipulatively successful in creating a pro-intervention climate in the country, where popularly Americans were hollering for intervention to help the poor Cubans, etc. Right? You also had ideas like the white man's burden, right? Saying, hey, uh, in connection to the other aforementioned ideas, right? That if life is a Darwinian struggle and if we need to get more aggressive, let's make it worthwhile for the people that the smaller, weaker nations that we're aggressive toward, and let's do kind of a quid pro quo with them. Is that we're going to get what we want from these small islands and countries, but in return, we'll help them develop an educational system. We'll create utilities of electricity and water. We'll provide vaccines for the people so they don't die in such large numbers of disease, right? Help them with a public school system, et cetera, et cetera. And so that whole white man's burden rhetoric, sorry about that, became very influential as well, right? And so people are hearing and thinking about that. And by the way, if you want to look into evidence for that, I arguably would recommend a book on by H.W. Brands on American colonization of the Philippines at the turn of the 19th century. Very interesting book. But at any rate, um, so you have that pressure, right? Now you have congressmen and cabinet members and the leaders of the Navy, like Benjamin Tracy and others, who are strong adherents to these beliefs, and they're all pushing for intervention and for more aggressive foreign policy, right? And the court history depiction is, if you look at Grover Cleveland as president, and even after him, William McKinley, there's evidence of a lot of hesitation to do this, right? As if for a while they were doves. They didn't want war. They didn't want to get aggressive. You even have quotes about McKinley of congressmen saying, we'll declare war without him, etc. Right? But then what ultimately gets us involved, right? So that's court history. Is McKinley was kind of bullied and pushed into asking Congress to declare war. And remember also, there's a famous thesis that there was a spirit of the age, a zeitgeist during the 1890s with Darwinism in vogue and everything, and the writings of Nietzsche, and going back to your primal military roots and all that, that culturally it was suicidal as a politician to look effeminate or weak, that you had to project manliness and strength, etc. So according to that thesis, right, McKinley was almost ironically bullied into asking Congress to declare war. However, I subjectively believe that the depictions I've read about McKinley being an enigma, a puzzle, right, a paradox of a man, is while you do absolutely have evidence to convey that image, right, of McKinley, eventually, right, he starts giving speeches about all the money that was lost in on the island of Cuba by dual nationals, those who were both Cuban and American citizens, right? Remember the Fifth and 14th Amendments say the government is to protect our lives, liberty, and property. What does that mean overseas? Different administrations interpret it differently. He suggested that he was going to interpret it broadly, that it included Americans overseas as well and protect their property. So he began worried about the money being lost in Cuba. He also began rhetoric about giving Christianity, which was ironic because the Spanish brought Catholic Christianity to the Philippines, right? But about Christianizing the Filipinos, right? And then ultimately, he gives an ultimatum that arguably he should have known could not have been met by Spain. He gave them a time window under which they had to come to terms with the Cuban rebels and their leadership, or else the U.S. was going to intervene. Well, he should have known that at that time, even with a liberal administration under Spain, under Projeda Sagasta, that he was for meeting the Cubans in the middle, as well as the Puerto Ricans and Filipinos under Spain. Is he was going to give them limited autonomy, kind of like Canada under England and Great Britain, is they could have their own internal government, make their own internal domestic legislation, but when it came to foreign policy and their armed forces, the mother country would still control them. Puerto Rico took that. The Puerto Rican rebel leadership actually accepted those terms. Okay, the Filipino, they were known as the Katipunan with Emilio Aguinaldo. They said no, thank you, as did the Cuban leaders, right? Because they wanted nothing short of complete independence. But with the liberals going that far, they couldn't go any further, arguably, without losing a majority in their parliament back in their Spanish country, because it was out of, it was seen as a sense of tradition and the dignity of Spain to have an empire. And so it would have been politically suicidal for them to just let go of the islands and just let them go without a fight. So Sagasta, the prime minister of Spain, he proverbially had his hands tied behind his back. He could only do so much. And there's reason to believe that McKinley knew that. So giving him this ultimatum that he knew arguably could not be met, was he trying to find an excuse now to get involved in this war? And then when we fought, he contended, okay, well, for practical reasons, most of the Spanish Navy happens to be in Manila, Philippines. So we need to fight in the Philippines. Because remember, with the rhetoric of Congress and even the declaration of war, with the with some of the stipulations to the declaration, we emphasized helping the Cubans. Not much was mentioned at all about the other islands. So what are we doing, right, in Puerto Rico and in the Philippines? So in the Philippines, right, we came, fought with the Navy, um, defeated them rather lopsidedly, but then stayed there and didn't leave. Then the Filipino people, right, met at Malolos, and they created a constitution that was modeled almost exactly after that of the United States. So that should have impressed us that they wanted that type of government, right? But instead, we said, no, don't be silly, Filipinos. You can't run your own republic like we can. We're going to put you on a timeline, basically, right? So you eventually become independent and you're going to be under our tutelage for a while. And for a while, ended up being basically from 1900 to 1946. And so, is there more to this, right? Because McKinley was, and his stance on keeping us on the gold standard, anti-unions and strikes, he seemed to be pro big business in almost every other facet of his platform. And so was he in the pockets of big business and wanting an excuse eventually or the whole time around to get involved in these islands? And in Puerto Rico, when our forces were sent there, they literally had been warned that we do not know if the Puerto Rican people are going to embrace us as liberators to help them fight the Spanish, or if they're going to see us as invaders and actually fight against us. So that says a lot, right? That's evidence, arguably, that we knew that the Puerto Ricans were not even asking us for their help, but we came anyway. And to this day, we have Puerto Rico in a very awkward political situation. They're not an unincorporated territory, but neither are they a state, right? They have one representative in Congress, but the person has no vote. And so they're in this limbo stage with us to this day, right? And so, and not to mention, you look at all the big sugar planters and coffee growers that enriched themselves on the Puerto Rican island as soon as we took it at the end of the Spanish American War. So to me, um, I think that I subjectively think that McKinley was a quite an enigma, quite a puzzle of a man. All right. So let's see here. Then in fighting, right? All other revisionist interpretations, more cynical interpretations. You have the lobbyist thesis, right? That the missionaries and the big businesses that wanted contracts to sell food and guns to our soldiers, who wanted to get um, lucrative opportunities to buy land and become sugar plantation owners and other things on these islands, that they lobbied Congress and lobbied the president and put pressure on him to fight this Spanish American War. You have the thesis that, like with the gold bugs, right? They wanted to keep us on the gold standard. They espoused over and over again the best way to get us out of a depression. We had arguably the worst depression we would have before the Great Depression of 29 in 1893. The best way, they said, to get us out of this depression is to be able to forcefully dump our excess products onto foreign markets, right? Especially markets with as many, millions of people as the Philippines had. And so you have that thesis as well, these more cynical interpretations. Some even say that it was time for a healthy distraction. Again, because you have like Secretary of State Gresham, who said there are symptoms of a revolution here in the US, and it might be good to deflect the poor's attention onto a patriotic foreign war against the Spanish, right? Instead of fighting one another. So those are all much more cynical revisionist interpretations to the Spanish-American War. All right. Um, let's see here. And then also, when we fought the Spanish-American War, it was rather brief. It was relatively, it entailed relatively few casualties. So John Hay is going to somewhat sarcastically say that this was a splendid little war for us. We gained a lot, and it didn't come at much of a cost, right? The Spanish-American War. So when we fought it, firstly, the Spanish, they made some poor decisions with the deployment of their troops and in their tactics on the island of Cuba. Look up like Santiago and look what they did, bottling themselves into that city, um, then getting blockaded, then getting the threat of their water being cut off to that city, and being talked into surrender. Uh, they uh, they made some, in hindsight, some very poor decisions. Uh, our small arms, the Spanish were fine as far as their being comparable with ours, but larger artillery and battleships, etc., it was very lopsided in our favor. All right. So keep that in mind. But like I said, with the Filipinos and the Puerto Ricans, it was, for lack of a better word, awkward when we came to help them because they arguably didn't even want our help. All right. Let's see here. So, and then also remember the role of the Buffalo Soldiers, of the African American soldiers that fought. They fought pivotally in surrounding Santiago at a place called El Cañe, um, and Las Guasimas and these other areas. And of course, the most famously, San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill, where Teddy Roosevelt became a legend, right? It was first an African American cavalry unit that went up that hill and was taking high casualties when he decided to come up and help them. All right. So hence, I feel like we've done number 15 as well. So, and then when it comes to imperialism, uh, just suffice it to say now, okay, the I would make the argument that imperialism in the Hawaiian Islands, if I subjectively were to be given the task of writing an argumentative write up on it, I would take a revisionist stance. There's a lot of dirt on it as far as just self interest, business self interest amongst the sugar planters, right? Um, Castle and Cook, a guy named Lauren Thurston, they highly enriched themselves in the Hawaiian Islands. And under there were two. There was Kalakua and Kamehameha III. They one of them with Kamehameha, they forced him to establish a government. They called it the Bayonet Constitution because it was at the end of a bayonet of a gun. They forced him to create a republic that had such high requirements for property requirements for citizenship that it disenfranchised most of the native Polynesian people, most of the native Hawaiians weren't even citizens now in their own republic. And it gave great powers to a cabinet of Haole, of white Americans, right? And the Haole and the cabinet arguably made a puppet of a couple of the Polynesian kings prior to Queen Liliuokalani. And when Liliuokalani came in, she said, I'm doing an end to this republic. I'm going to be more responsive to my Polynesian people and not be as no longer be a puppet to the sugar planter interest. And then they came, visited the administration of Benjamin Harrison, and got the help they needed. They also had Stevenson as an ambassador and Spencer Tracy as in charge of the Navy. And they brought in Marines into the Hawaiian Island as soon as Liliuokalani threatened to arrest Lauren Thurston and these rebels against her new government. And so I definitely would take a revisionist stance subjectively, and that's number 14. And remember, the Platt Amendment was a very much a source of Cuban anger toward us in 1902 as we stuck around for 4 years in Cuba and helped bring about, quote, improvements, paving roads, providing water and electricity, sanitation brigades against disease, and for proper sewage treatment, etc. But then under the Platt Amendment, we gave ourselves the right to intervene in Cuba in the future whenever our self-interest was at stake, or for the sake of quote Cuban stability. We gave ourselves the right to militarily intervene in Cuba, so greatly, right, diminishing Cuba's independence in reality. All right, and that's number 18. So then finally on to World War One. Remember with Woodrow Wilson, you have the irony, many ironies of his, kind of like with Thomas Jefferson. He talked big as a progressive and as an old school liberal, but when he became president, his administration was very conservative in many ways, right? And the common thesis is that circumstances beyond his control that he had not foreseen that had arisen made him feel compelled to take a different route and be more pragmatic or practical and choose the lesser evil in certain circumstances. So remember, we fought World War One because of German violations of our international rights on the seas, right? German unrestricted submarine warfare, the Lusitania, the Panther, the Arabic, and lots of Americans dying, being sunk by the German submarines while we were just trying to trade to Europe while we were neutral for the first 3 years of World War One, from 14 to 17. Um, he his administration finally, when we declare war, right, we're not ready, and so hence he declares eventually that we need to have a draft. And so he was all about individual autonomy, but yet he issues a draft, right? But he says he needs to. Then the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, known as the Wobblies, they started engaging in sabotage at some of our factories that were producing war materiel in Washington State and other areas. So he does a kind of a red scare and it institutes a crackdown on these that involved the deportations back to Russia of some people like Emma Goldman eventually and others, mass deportations to other states, arrests under the Espionage Act. Remember, the Espionage Act is if you undermine the war effort in any way, including kept people from joining in the draft, that you could be arrested for such, right? Remember, his Supreme Court initiated the clear and present danger clause in the Carl Schenck case, which was an infringement on our First Amendment rights, right? Or at least a curtailment, cutting it short, whereby if your self-expression creates an environment of clear and present danger, you can no longer express it. All right. So you have that going on as well in a conservative fashion. Well, he needs as many goods as possible, as quickly as possible, right? So we can't go to thousands of mom and pop shops, arguably. So he goes to big business and he enriches the very big businesses that he claimed he wanted to break up when he ran for president in 1912. So he's enriching them with the War Industries Board, right? And getting war material from them. He tried to alleviate his conscience and having Samuel Gompers, a big labor union leader, decide who got the contracts. So hence, if they had a poor reputation in their treatment of workers, they wouldn't receive the contract and be punished accordingly. Also, during if you received a government contract, you had to provide minimum wages, maximum work hours. All right, but still, he did just that. He initiated the Committee on Public Information, right, the CPI, which basically became a propaganda campaign, and he was for individual intellectual autonomy. But this is ironic, right? Now he's running a propaganda campaign, but he was worried about German Americans, Irish and English Americans duking it out. And we had some scares with certain cases of explosions and bombs in a subway in New York, in a naval yard, etc. One German composer threatened to assassinate President Wilson. And so there was this great anti-German phobia that overtook the country. There were these patriotic leagues that acted as almost like vigilante groups against German immigrants and German Americans, and he sanctioned it. He gave his full sanction to them and told them to report to the government any type of espionage or treason that they could find. All right. Um, let's see here. And then also, he tried to have progressive legislation with the doughboys that fought overseas, right? He tried to keep them from prostitutes and alcohol, and it did not work successfully at all. He also was plagued by conflict between our doughboys, our soldiers, and their officers for various reasons I don't have time to get into, but a lot of friction between officers and men. There was also friction between us and the French leader, Ferdinand Foch, and others who were given command over our American troops, because there was resentment that we had taken so long to join the war effort with the Triple Entente. And so there was evidence to suggest that maybe the French were almost vindictively throwing American soldiers on the front lines, the most dangerous positions, to kind of make up for lost time and out of anger. And so there was conflict and friction in that regard as well. Okay, um, let's see here. However, in fighting World War One, our numbers mattered. We know that from Erich Ludendorff himself, one of the two military leaders of Germany during World War One. He and Hindenburg. We have quotes from him saying that because, for instance, like in the Argonne Mu River region, we had at any given time 1.5 million doughboy soldiers on the battlefield at a time. And so that was part of the German decision to surrender at the end of World War One. But when they did surrender, right? When they did surrender, there was a sense of that the Treaty of Versailles was so vindictive toward the Germans in particular, right? Article 10. Um, in Article 51, the Germans had to claim responsibility for the war. They had to give up, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had to give up their empires and allow self-determination for all the small countries that they had taken over, and ethnic groups, etc., right? So Yugoslavia, Poland, all these new countries would form from Austria-Hungary, um, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, all of them would form from the Ottoman Empire, etc. But Article 10 said the winners didn't have to. So England could keep a hold of South Africa. France could keep a hold of Algeria. America could keep a hold of Puerto Rico and the Philippines. It was very hypocritical. And so the 14 points, right? Uh, the idea that there would be an international body that would conserve multilaterally the beliefs of liberalism, the autonomy of the individual, human rights entitled to every individual, self-determination for every small country in particular, right? That it would have like a world court that would adjudicate disputes, and that if someone invaded someone else, they would also have an international army that would go fight against the bully, right? Well, all of that became the League of Nations, and we didn't even join it because the Republicans back in our administration refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty. So we had to make a separate peace with the Central Powers. So at any rate, you have all of that going on that's relevant to this test. Let's see here. 35. Give me just a moment here. Sorry. 3. African Americans, their hope, their expectations were argumentatively raised during World War One because they were largely put under Foch's French army, and they fought under French officers with French soldiers. And the French were more progressive. They had been from at least the 1700s, if not sooner, on race relations. So they were treated well and were given responsibilities that they would not have been given under the United States Armed Forces, etc. And that arguably played a part in the Harlem Renaissance and things that are going to happen after they come back from World War One. Okay. However, you have the case of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Young, who was going to become the first full-blown colonel of African American ancestry, and the high command would not let that happen. They honorably discharged him on account of his asthma for medical reasons, because they did not want to take on the forces back at home, the Southern Democrats, etc., and and the symbolism of such a case. So again, emblematic of Woodrow Wilson's administrations and the progressive movement entirely. Arguably, its failure to really take on and defeat racial discrimination. All right. So let's see here. Trying to see what's left of World War One. I believe we've covered everything pertinent to World War One. And remember, another thing with as far as hypocrisy of Woodrow Wilson's administration, he invaded Mexico twice but remember I had given my explanation for that. Remember the first one was because uh, the death of Francisco Madero and the refusal of the Mexican military elite to allow elections to choose their next president. And then Pancho Villa crossed the border and attacked Columbus, New Mexico, and killed 21 Americans because Woodrow Wilson stopped aiding him and continued to give aid to Carranza instead. Okay. Dominican Republic and Haiti, they violated Teddy Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, being politically stable and financially responsible, or else we would intervene. In one case, I think it was Haiti, there was the assassination of their president. And in one, and I think perhaps in the other one, Dominican Republic, it was a default of loans to a foreign bank. But then in the cases, right, like with Haiti, we had a free and fair election that our troops supervised supposedly, and then when it did happen, um, the new president resigned, and civil war ensued again. So he kept troops there and said the Haitians were not ready for self government, and so he kept Marines on that island. All right, and let's see here. All right, now moving to the Roaring Twenties. Are there any questions? We're almost done. All right, you sure? Okay, so the culture war of the 1920s, right? That was the kind of discourse that I put as the foundation of your argumentative assignment. Basically, right? Those who were fighting against the changes that American society was experiencing during the 1920s, right? Urbanization, the influence of social Darwinism and science, excessive consumerism, and kind of a laissez-faire, almost a deviant popular culture, right? Remember, in deviant, in the sociological sense, is that you want to deviate from what traditionally you were taught is normative behavior and are acceptable values, right? Like the Victorian value system. And so you have that, okay, as the culture war. So um, you had, of course, the new woman, and the new woman, right? She fought against sexual double standards, right? She increased her adolescence. Many young women now were increasingly going to work and receiving independent salaries, and a much higher percentage of young women, in particular, were going to colleges and not getting married at least as early as prior to, right? And having more time to kind of sow their wild oats, if you will, etc. You have people blaming the automobile, postmodernism, Freud's philosophy, all the excessive consumerism that was getting involved, and people's growing purchasing power during the 1920s. In many cases, purchasing power went up 38%, right, with disposable income during the 20s. Electrification and nightlife, the jazz music movement, right, and all the jazz clubs, etc. All that going on. Uh, However, most women still did not become economically self-sufficient. Okay, I need you to remember that. Um, so let's see here. Then you have, of course, the fight on alcohol by way of the 18th Amendment, and then it was repealed in the 20th Amendment against the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol. The Volstead Act put it at like less than 1% alcohol constituted an alcoholic beverage. And so at that time, right, arguably you could say that it had limited success when you look at the number of convictions under the Volstead Act. Izzy and Moe became famous for having tons and tons of arrests as detectives, etc. But arguably, right, they said that for every distillery, illegal distillery making alcohol, at least 9 were still operating. 1/10 of our National Guard were removed from their position for taking bribes and turning a blind eye to the transportation of alcohol through their area. So it was very limited in its success. People attribute it to weak enforcement. There was only $2 million, which, although it went much further back then, that still was not nearly enough. only 1,500, 1,500 for the whole country, federal agents employed. And then they invoked the concurrent powers clause and said that the states had to share the responsibility of enforcing it. 5 states said no. Famously, the certain mayors, like the Chicago mayor, said no, they're not even going to try to enforce it. And so you had this kind of deviant popular culture. Arguably, you had the fact that it arguably wasn't that properly embraced to begin with. The state legislators were not that representative of the entire populations of the states at that time. Representation was pretty weak. So that it was finally approved by enough state ratification conventions does not necessarily mean that it was approved by the majority of American people to begin with. Okay. And so, and then of course, right, it's going to open up lots of press about the famous bootleggers, Al Capone and others in Chicago in particular, right? I wish I had more time for that stuff, guys. And then of course you have the Scopes trial that was fought out, right, over religion and over social the exospecies evolution, that theory being taught in biology classes in Tennessee. They forbade it. The ACLU took him to court for firing John T. Scopes for teaching it to his high school biology students. And the local case just blew up as far as press coverage. It became kind of circus like. Remember, they were supposed to adhere to who has jurisdiction to determine curriculum, what constitutes academic freedom, both for students and for teachers. But instead, it became a holy war fighting over the veracity of the Bible, etc. Right? Um, Technically, John T. Scopes continued to lose his job, and the local judge decided in favor of the superintendent uh, 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 decision to forbid the teaching of macrospecies evolutionary theory. But according to the press, right, and to some historians, the liberals really made a lot of headway and sympathy for their cause on behalf of scientific inquiry, epistemology, right? Like follow the facts where they go before you come to know something, and don't dogmatically just believe something because it's told you. And so, yeah, so you have that with the Scopes trial. Sacco and Vanzetti was a big case because they were charged with theft and murder and eventually executed. But the fact that they were Italian anarchists may have had a lot to do with the judge's decision to convict them, because the evidence against them was technically circumstantial and not direct. And so it became an issue of xenophobia, right? Of fear and hatred toward things that are unfamiliar and outside your realm of familiarity. And so there was tough legislation against immigration during the 20s as well. And then the Harlem Renaissance. Remember, it arguably it was brought about because of the Great Migration of African Americans to the North during World War I. Like 1.5 million of them, at least, moved up during that time into cities like Detroit, Chicago, Harlem. You also have crossover instances, like Bessie Smith's music and the radio, right? As a black musician, and many others, right? Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington. It's a long list of 20s African American jazz and other musicians. As I mentioned, in the case of Josephine Baker, very popular as an entertainer, but she encountered racism everywhere she went to entertain. A great irony there. Harlem, highly visited, but I'm sorry, I'm getting away from myself. Going back to the alleged causes. You had the Shuffle Along musical that took the country by storm. A guy named Carl Van Vechten wrote a book called Inward Heaven, and it was kind of like an Uncle Tom's Cabin, sympathizing with the plight of young African American boys in the urban ghetto areas. Um, and then the AAAC, or the NAACP, right? National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, under W.E.B. Du Bois and others. They're going to have literary and other type of intellectual contests that get a lot of public press coverage, right, for young Black Americans to engage in. And that's how Langston Hughes and others became famous. You have in this Harlem itself was going to stay dilapidated. Remember, there's a guy named Philip Payton and others who tried to create a middle class suburban area out of Harlem of Black Americans, and there was a great white racist backlash that kept that from happening. Oftentimes, white Americans contended that when they went into Harlem to the Cotton Club and other areas, that they were slumming, and they projected their own kind of, in particular, their id, if you will, right, to go and get wild, drink, their sexual fantasies. They projected them onto the African Americans, right, and said that, well, that's how they are, that's their natural state, and this is just an anomalous, out of the ordinary visit for me. And so, to an extent, right, you can make the sad argument that the social acceptance and integration were not achieved, sadly, by the Harlem Renaissance, despite the great interest in it and great respect for this flowering of African American culture during the 1920s. And then also with the Harlem Renaissance, you had the identity crisis that you see in the writings of Langston Hughes and Count Colin, whereby the protagonist oftentimes is torn between a desire to assimilate and become as white as possible and be accepted by white America, and then a frustration in knowing that he likely never will, and resorting back to a pride and being who he is and being Black as an American. And then some went further than that, right? When I think of like Paul Robeson and others, where they said, you know what, um, we're going to be proud of who we are, right? Claude McKay, right? His famous poem, "If We Must Die, We're going to Go Down Swinging," and they were generically called the New Negro, like under Marcus Garvey, right? Was said, you know what, fine. If white America doesn't want us, we're going to stay separate, and we're going to be proud of being Black and form our own identity, become self-sufficient, etc. And also, in some of these cases, there was an acceptance of um, socialist and communist ideology as well amongst some of these Harlem Renaissance writers and artists and musicians. And then lastly, Warren G. Harding, oftentimes in the popular interpretations were, as the president from 20 to 23, that his administration embodied the image, the popular image of the Roaring Twenties, as being kind of laissez-faire, like laissez-faire morally, right? Buy into consumption, consume, use credit, and just spin yourself into debt to keep up with the Joneses. Kind of hedonistically live for today and let tomorrow worry about itself. Deviate from Victorian norms. And of course, right, Harding had multiple affair scandals on his wife. And you had the Teapot Dome scandal and other scandals of his cabinet, his administration. They literally had a place in Washington, D.C., where some of his cabinet members regularly took bribes for people selling alcohol and bribes to get a position in his government, etc. And of course, he dies by 23. He was only 55 when he was elected, very healthy, and kind of as a microcosm of the 20s, he lived a wild lifestyle, and he didn't last long, and it burned out like the 20s, leading to the Great Depression. And then and so that's just the thing is it's tied, this laissez-faire attitude and Republican policy, right, is tied into Keynesian economics, Keynesian interpretation to the Great Depression, that the government did not do enough to regulate the economy, and that helped cause the Great Depression, right, especially under the Secretary of Treasury Andrew Mellon, who did not enforce the antitrust laws, and who did almost not even tax Americans at this time, for instance. All right. So, are there any questions? I finally finished. I've crossed out all 45 questions.
Take a breath.
Thank you. I'm exhausted.
I think I'm okay. I'm going to go back over the part I missed in the beginning, but
Sure.
I kept up pretty well. And if I read through them now, I can kind of get my answers and it'll all click for
You
me.
got
Thank
it.
you.
No, thank you, Polly. I appreciate you. Anybody else?
I can't think of anything. I
Okay,
think I'm like Polly. I'll go back through when I look at it. I think that that it'll click now.
sure. Good, good. I hope so. Good, good. All right. So if that's it, you guys, I'm gonna go ahead and I think I'm gonna go lay down on my couch for about 20 minutes. All right.
Thank you
But
so much.
I'm sorry.
We were just saying thank you.
No, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Okay. I enjoy you guys. I hope that you do well. Remember, okay, on this particular one, it's only one 50-point assignment out of like, well, we have at least 13 assignments and then 3 tests. So it's only one 50-point assignment out of 16. But no longer after the first test, I usually have just one submission only. So do your best, okay? But don't stress out about it. Just do your best. And I hope you do well, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. You guys have a great week.
You
You
too.
too.
All
You
right.
too.
Oh,
Bye-bye.
just to let you know, I have some catch up to do if you haven't noticed. And my statistics class has been just completely crazy, and astronomy altogether. And I just want you to know I'm going to catch those up. And so what you went over today gives me a little more insight into what I'm looking forward to reading and
Good.
writing about. Okay.
Good, Polly.
Those
Okay,
up.
and remember, if you would, okay, if oh gosh, if I haven't even made it to that assignment, you don't need to worry about informing me. But if it's something that goes back pretty far, like Gilded Age, the West, that this goes for everyone, please just remind me, okay, to go back to and find your assignment if it's
Okay.
late, if I've already gone through that assignment with the class, okay?
Yeah, you
Just
might want to do that with my first one. I think it was late, and so it never got graded on reconstruction. I think
oh
was that the
shoot,
first.
yeah, yes,
So it's there.
yeah.
It hasn't been graded. So
Okay, so I'll make a note of that, Polly. But yeah,
okay.
just for future reference for everyone, please, if it's something that you believe we may have already gone over, like one of the first 3 assignments, give me a Canvas message so I know to go back and find it. Okay?
Okay. Thanks again.
You're very welcome. Thank you guys. Have a good day,
Thanks.
okay?
You too.
You too.
Bye-bye.